Okay, thank you. I'm going to do something slightly different to what Tony has done. I basically agree with with what I take to be the thrust of what he said, and that is that that our understanding of Russia is too much shaped by a very hawkish view, which is propounded by those who wish to maintain particular power structures in Europe and the US, and it is a very distorted picture. What I want to do instead is to suggest that Russia faces at least three major problems. They're there now, and unless they do something about them within the next decade, they're going to get significantly worse. I'm going to say what those three problems are, and then I'm going to look around within Russia itself to see whether there's any indication there of how they may be able to solve these problems. The first is an economic problem. It's quite clear that the Russian economy has been running into problems. Now, those problems are in part a function of the imposition of sanctions as a result of going into Ukraine in 2014. It's in part a function of the decline, or the dramatic drop in oil and gas prices, upon which the Russian economy has relied since at least the 1960s, when it was the Soviet economy. But it's also clear that there is a need for major reform in the Russian economy. One way in which that reform is needed is that there needs to be greater diversification of the economy away from oil and gas. But there is also a need to reinvest in the industrial sector of the economy and in the agricultural sector. And there's no sign of that having been done thus far under Putin in the 16 odd years that he's been in power. The second problem that they're going to need to look at is the political problem, because they have a political system which is clearly not democratic. Now, I'm not saying that they necessarily have to have a democratic system, but it's also a system which, within the medium term, if it continues the way it is likely to run into major issues, because it is at the moment oriented around one person. And what happens when that one person goes? We could have another time of troubles, which is what they referred to in 1613 when there was mass unrest and finished up with the new Tsar. Or you could have the collapse of the system, ultimately, if the political system ceases to function in an effective fashion. So there is a need to look at changes in that. The third problem is the strategic problem. And the strategic problem is the international problem. It's certainly the case that Russia finds itself in a dead end in relations with the West. How can it get out of that? Ideally, it would require a change in attitude on the part of the West. But it may be that Russia needs to do something as well. And is the relationship with China as good as Tony suggests? And is the relationship with North Korea one that's going to be a problem? And the situation in Syria. So I'm going to talk about all that in about 15 minutes. Okay. March of 2018, there will be a presidential election, new presidential election. Putin has not said he will stand as yet, but the likelihood is that he will. We know for certain two people who are going to stand. One is a guy called Grigory Yavlinsky, who was a liberal economist under Gorbachev, stood for the presidency under Yeltsin, competed against Yeltsin, got about 3 or 4% of the vote. So the likelihood is he's not going to get up. The other person is Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who's the head of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, party which is neither liberal nor democratic. But he has also stood on a number of occasions for the presidency, and compared with Yavlinsky's 3 and 4%, he's tended to get 5 or 6%. So the likelihood is he's not going to get up either. Putin currently has an approval rating of 83%. The lowest it's been in about a decade is about 63%, and that was just before the takeover of Crimea. After the takeover of Crimea, it shot from 63 up to about 83, and it stayed round about there. So Putin is very, very popular. Now, it's not clear the basis of that popularity in the sense that it differs from group to group, but if he stands, and the odds are that he will, I mean, what else is he going to do? You know, what else is he going to do? The odds are that he will stand and that he'll win the presidency. The problem, of course, is that he's not addressed these problems I talked about in the 3 earlier terms of presidency that he's had, so the likelihood is that he won't address them in the 4th. So that means if we're going to look for where the source of change is going to come from, you can't look for it from the president. Maybe we can look for it in political parties, because I mean that's the way things work in the West, that if you're looking for change, it's often through the party system that it comes. The problem is that, as the parliamentary elections of last year showed, the opposition parties are still in a mess. The opposition is fragmented. They cannot unite into single parties that can gather together the vote, so that you have a series of, for example, liberal parties, what we would call liberal parties, all of whom have 10 members, but they all go and they compete for the same votes, so that the opposition vote is continually fragmented. And this is reflected, in part, in the result of the last parliamentary election, the Duma election, when Putin's party won 343 seats out of 450. I mean, there is no effective opposition. The opposition is bereft of ideas, it's bereft of organisational talent, and it is dominated by people with very large egos, which prevent them from getting together and combining and uniting. At one stage, there was a lot of American money going in to support the opposition parties in Russia. So it's okay. So this is one of the hypocrisies that Tony is talking about. So it's okay for American money to go in to support the opposition in Russia, but it's not okay for Russian support for the opposition in the US, if it in fact happened. But anyway. So they were sustained for a while on the basis of Western support, but then laws were introduced which made it very difficult for any organisation which got foreign money to continue to function effectively in the political arena, so that the basis of them disappeared. So effectively, the what we would see as the opposition political parties are not really viable as major forces for change, particularly while you have an administration which is highly disciplined, which is centralised, and which knows how to win the elections when the elections are held. So if we can't look to the parties, what about other civil society groups? One of the really striking things about what happened in the Soviet Union after Gorbachev came to power was the development of a range of new civil society organisations. There were political parties, nascent political parties, but there were also all sorts of organisations talking about things from the fate of political prisoners all the way through to how you collect stamps. A whole range of organisations emerged. They have continued in Russia. But again, they are very weak. They do not politically organise. And the Putin regime, Putin government, if you like, has introduced measures which hampers the activity of these sorts of organisations. Again, the so-called Foreign Agents Bill is an example. Any organisation that gets any money at all from outside Russia needs to register as a foreign agent. That's the term that's used. Now, of course, to you and I, the notion of a foreign agent might not mean very much. But to the Russian populace, thinking back to the Stalinist purges, they were accused. People who were put on trial were accused of being foreign agents. So that there's a real sort of nasty sort of edge to this. And what it means is that effectively much of the civil society organisations that exist have really been sort of demobilised or hamstrung, so that they also do not act as effective political organisations in the way that many groups in this country, for example, do. A third possible area that we might want to look for some sort of change is sort of the mass of the population. Now, the reason for saying that is that after the parliamentary elections in 2011, which were marked by fraud, as all of the Russian elections have been marked by fraud from the time when Yeltsin was president all the way through to the one last year. But 2011 was different because in previous years, although the fraud had occurred, and the fraud has been acknowledged by election observers, it's pretty clear that there was. But what differed last year, in 2011, is that people began to protest, so that you had demonstrations on the streets of Moscow. The largest demonstration comprised 100. It depends who you ask, right? According to the organisers, there were 300,000 people. According to the police, there were 10,000 people. According to observers, press observers, there were probably about 150,000 people. They were sort of a reasonable size demonstration. So you'd think that perhaps this provides the basis where you might think that there might be a move for change within Russia. Well, the problem is that those demonstrations, for a whole range of sort of reasons which I can go into and question if you want, but those demonstrations basically petered out over time. They got smaller and smaller and had less and less effect. And basically, the regime said, we don't care. It's not important that you are doing this. However, in March of this year and in June of this year, demonstrations occurred again. The guy who was the leader, the notional leader of the 2011 demonstrations, a fellow called Navalny, made his name as a blogger uncovering official corruption, basically. And he finished up being the figurehead of these demonstrations. Later on, he was arrested, he was charged with corruption himself, he was tried, he was found guilty of corruption, and he was jailed, but he was then let out. And because he was found guilty, he now can't run in the presidential election next year, which is what he says he's going to do. However, what Navalny did was that he mobilised people onto the streets again, but this time he did it on the basis of corruption, not electoral fraud, not anything else. It was corruption. He produced a movie, you see it on YouTube, that purports to show all the palaces and these sorts of things that the Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev owns. Anyway, he mobilised the populace on the basis of corruption for these two demonstrations. In addition, in Moscow, there were demonstrations beginning in May because of changes that are going to be made to housing in Moscow. But the important thing is that what's different about these, compared with the 2011-2012 protests, is that 2011-12 were seen overwhelmingly as sort of middle class protests. And of course, Putin says the middle class you can buy off. He doesn't say it out loud, but this is what he thinks. And there's a good literature that shows that actually you can do that. The later protests were mainly young people. Mainly young people. And as the Soviets used to say, it is no accident that since those protests began, we have seen Putin interacting with young people in ways that he never did before. So there are lots of pictures of him surrounded by not just pretty girls, which he was prone to do before, but variety of young people. And he runs this thing called the direct line once a year. People from right across the country can phone in their questions to him, and he sits there and he answers the questions. And it goes for 3 or 4 hours. It's enormously long. It's boring, but it's enormously long. And the questions are clearly sort of vetted and that sort of thing, so he doesn't get questions that he can't answer or anything. But this has always been a sort of a general thing at the end of the year. Anyway, about 6 weeks ago, he held a special one only with young people. So there's clearly a bit of a worry in the Kremlin, particularly with the election coming up, that it may be that young people, and these young people are seen as sort of Putin's kids. Putin's been in power since 2000, so the only politics that they know is the politics of Putin, that Putin's kids may be turning against him. It's too early to say that that's the case, but there's clearly sort of a concern about that. So what I'm effectively saying is, if Putin's kids don't actually sort of take up the slack and become politically involved, it seems to me that if Putin is re-elected for another 6-year term, that you're unlikely to get an addressing of these problems from the political system itself. Now, what about the international world? Well, I think the only way in which Russia can hope to get out of the sort of dead end that it's in with the West is to hang on, continue not to be bullied in the way in which is the want of various Western powers, but they are also going to need, I think, to make some concessions somewhere. And it would seem to me that in a variety of places there are different sorts of concessions that both sides need to make, but Ukraine is clearly one, because Ukraine remains a major thorn in the relationship between the two. Now, part of the problem for Putin and for the Europeans, I mean, the Americans, and for the Americans also, but the Europeans are more important for Ukraine than the Americans are. One of the problems, of course, is that you now have in Kiev a government which is for a variety of different reasons taking what seem to me to be unreasonable stances on this. But ultimately, I think what Russia could offer is not to give up Crimea, because Russia will want to keep Crimea for a whole variety of reasons. Emotional, defence reasons are important, and they're now building this thumping great bridge between Crimea and the main part of Russia to sort of connect the two, so you don't have to go through Ukraine. So they're going to hold on to Crimea. But there may be concessions that can be made in eastern Ukraine. What Russia, I think, should argue for, and they have talked about this, but it hasn't been taken up, is a federal Ukraine. In other words, a Ukraine in which the Russian separatist groups remain in Ukraine, but have a degree of local autonomy. And we need to remember that when the Soviet Union fell apart, in the Ukrainian referendum, all parts of the country, including the Russian-speaking bits, said they wanted to be part of Ukraine, not part of Russia. So the issue is not as black and white, I guess I'm saying, as is often presented, and there may be scope there for them to reach some sort of agreement. Now, the other issue is China, because it has been argued by many people, including me, that that the continued Western confrontation with Russia will simply turn Russia towards the BRICS. It'll turn Russia towards other sorts of groupings of countries. The BRICS are, I can never get them all right, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa sometimes, yeah. It'll turn them towards the BRICS. The problem is that there's very little that actually unites them. And if we think about China, there's not a great deal in terms of the two economies which are complementary. It's much more likely that if the Russian economy was to develop, that they will be competitive rather than complementary. The other thing is that Russia is really worried about what's going to happen in Central Asia, because Central Asia they see as being vital to their own security and to the stability of the region. And they know that there is a historical legacy there which not all sections of Central Asia, Russian historical legacy which not all sections of Central Asia see positively. So they're worried that China is going to gain increased influence in this region to the exclusion of Russia. It was always said in the Soviet Union that the Soviet leader used to lie awake at night. I don't think he did, but it was always said he used to lie awake at night and think, what am I going to do if 1 million Chinese get up, walk across the river and settle? Well, you know what? They have. It's a significant level of Chinese immigration, temporary, into eastern Russia. And the Russians are aware of it. The Russians are worried about it. So there is a major problem here for them. If they're closed off with the West and the relationship is sort of all gummed up, they want to go towards China, but they know that there are basic sort of incompatibilities, if you like, which need to be worked out. And it may be that Putin can use his personal relationship with Xi Jinping and work them out, but it's also not clear that he'll be able to do that. Thank you.